the failure of the Federal Reserve, the failure of centralized decision-making in economics and politics. And as an alternative, I see the blockchain technology that has been proliferating through Bitcoin and Ethereum and many other first layer, second layer solutions into a possibility that we could have something like the Renaissance, where we have a substitution. Back then, we had a substitution of celestial decision-making into human-centric decision-making. Now we're going from human-centric decision-making towards an algorithmic decision-making process in the world economy and world politics. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's September 16, 2021. This is Krim Delco. For the day, we are down about 50 basis points. The market is down 30 basis points. For the year, we're up 12.4%. The market is up 19.3%. We're underperforming by 6.9%. So I want to, today's episode is a deep reflection on a concept that I find it very difficult to convey because I think it's very abstract. It's very much like the internet in the 90s. If you haven't seen it, if you haven't felt it, then it's very difficult to understand. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to explain what I'm thinking here. And what I'm thinking is that we are on the verge of societal change that is of the magnitude that happened during the Renaissance. And before I go there, I want to explain a little bit what happened during the Renaissance, and then I want to talk about where I see ourselves today. And then, of course, I want to talk about the potential implications of how I see this evolving, and also what it means for things like education, for things like businesses, for things like decision-making in general. So the Renaissance was the period in Europe between sort of the 15th and 16th century, when we had a massive proliferation of business, arts, independence of small states, particularly in Italy, Florence, Venice, and so on and so forth. I am actually right now in Rovinj, Croatia, which is about probably a 3-hour boat ride from Venice. So I'm very close to one of the epicenters of the Renaissance, and I'm going to go to Venice actually in about 10 days and visit some of their architects and some of the buildings that our architects built, and also see some of the art which was created in Venice. So what happened during the Renaissance is we had the transition from celestial decision-making towards human-centric decision-making. In other words, what is and what isn't was decided prior to the Renaissance in Europe, was decided by the church. Monks, the church, the Pope, the whole celestial hierarchy, starting with God, of course, and then the Pope as a representative of God on earth, and then all the way down to bishops and monks. They were the decision makers. They decided what is and what isn't. They decided who is king. They decided who is guilty, who isn't guilty. They decided who owns what, who owns real estate, all that stuff. They decided what money is. They decided who has the right to do business and who doesn't. All these things, which I would say are basically fundamental necessities of life, as we know it at least, were decided by the church. And during the Renaissance, we had a move away from that towards human-centric decision-making. It was the birth of the scientific method. Galileo, who was actually in Italy, in the state of Florence, started looking at the world, started questioning the celestial view of the world, and the sort of idea that the world is the center of the universe, and of course came up with mathematical solutions towards problems of physics. And then we went from there towards delivering the scientific method, which really in a nutshell, I think, is what Karl Popper is talking about when he talks about the idea of solving problems, coming up with new ideas for problems, coming up with new problems by solving problems, because that is not what the celestial system has been encouraging. Actually, that's not what the celestial system even wants. The celestial system had this attitude towards absolute knowledge, static knowledge, defined by the Bible, defined by theological thinking. Of course, there was some development within the theological community. There still is. Even today, you can still study theology in many parts of the world. So it's not completely static, but certainly not at the level of a Galileo method, where you question what you see, you question experiments with theory, you develop new theories, you then create new problems, develop new theories. We go from Galileo to Newton, from Newton to Einstein, and today we are questioning the quantum mechanics and trying to interpret them, maybe with Everett, with the multiverse theory, or whatever it is. I'm just trying to make the point here that the Renaissance was the big turning point in human history when we are going away from celestial toward human-centric decision-making, or in other words, who says what is and what isn't. Prior to the Renaissance, it's the church. Afterwards, it's humans, and humans then develop a hierarchy. There's lawyers, there's government officials, there is doctors, which decide what is and what isn't in the medical field. There are financial people that decide what isn't in the economic field. So there's all these professions that we still have today. A lot of the professions that started back in the Renaissance are actually still around today. I mean, we have finance. Finance uses a lot of Italian words. The account comes from the words conto, discount from these are Italian words that we still use in accounting because it was the Venetian and the Florentine bankers who started with this particular exercise and developed an economic theory and an economic way of life that we still have today. It was also the birth of the East India Company then throughout the colonization of the world, and then the first joint stock company in Amsterdam, and all these things started in that sort of period of time, maybe a bit later after the Renaissance, when we're talking about joint stock companies. But my point here is not to talk too much about history, but much more about using history as an analogy. Like whoever said history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. I think it was Mark Twain, but that's disputed. Doesn't matter. The point is that it is actually rhyming, because we are now at the same point where we're going from human-centric decision-making to algorithmic. Now, before I explain what the implications are, let me just explain the facts. So we have the blockchain technology. We have Bitcoin as one of the blockchains. We have Ethereum as another one. We have a couple of others. Algorand, one of the blockchains that we have invested in through their native token Algorand. And there's many more. The point here is that we have this surge of blockchains that are all trying to attempt the same thing, which is to be the ultimate decision maker of what is and what isn't. And we don't know exactly how this will evolve. It's probably going to evolve in a two-way direction. One will be a winner-takes-all situation. The other will be sort of a more sliced and more specific. Okay, Algorand will be good for trade finance, Bitcoin will be good for store of value, and Ethereum will be good for smart contracts, maybe something along those lines. The point here is that we have a decentralized algorithmic decision-making process. What does that really mean? That means that what is and what isn't is decided by the network. And the network is consistent of everybody who participates in the network, i.e. the people and the algorithms that underlie the network. So whoever participates in the network and uses the network as a reference point for example, decision-making in terms of what is and what isn't, is subject to the network's decision-making. Now, by definition, that excludes human-centric decision-making. So what that really means in very practical terms is that we are not going to listen to a government anymore. We are not going to listen to lawyers and bureaucrats to tell us how to do, what to do, and when to do what. We're going to listen to the network. A marriage will be defined by a smart contract and will be executed and enforced by the smart contract. So if somebody doesn't do whatever they're supposed to do within the context of the marriage, they will find solace or compensation through the smart contract. The point here might be considered when I talk to people about smart contracts and blockchain. It's very often viewed as this is just some Silicon Valley dream. Who cares? I mean, I want my son to be a lawyer, for example. I don't care what you're saying, and I'm not concerned about smart contracts taking away the lawyer's job and all that. And look, I get this I get this reaction a lot. I used to get this reaction also with the internet when I told people that journalism is dead. They would tell me, well, we don't really care about what you're saying. Journalism will be around for a long time, and then these things usually they go until they don't, and then they go very fast. And I think the same thing will happen here. So I have spoken about the problems of education and the challenge of education in previous episodes where we discussed the question of, let's say, well, what should one do as a sort of person that is now going to school and trying to educate themselves for the future and all that. And I think this episode here should not be about that. This episode should be, like I said in the prelude, about the failure of the Fed and the substitution of human-centered decision-making with algorithmic blockchain decision-making. This is the goal of this particular episode. So let's stick with that. And what I mean with the failure of the Fed and the failure of our human-centric political institutions, and then why is it going to be replaced by blockchain technology? What do I mean with that? Let's talk about the failure first. The Federal Reserve of the US, in my view, and this is a view that I'm sure I share with a lot of people, particularly in Silicon Valley, the Federal Reserve has failed on many fronts. In particular, it has failed because it has tried to meddle in the economy, and it has also lost its power because it has been hijacked by the government. So these are the two main reasons why central banking pretty much anywhere in the world doesn't function anymore. It's because the central banks, the big ones, Japan, Europe, and the US, all have been taken hostage by their governments. And because of the government debt being so high, the central banks have lost the power to manage the currency and the economy in any meaningful way. Now, you might say, well, who cares? And the answer is, well, who cares? I care. I care because as an economist, a business person, an investor, I know what this does to the function of money. Lenin said that if you want to kill capitalism, just kill the money. And that's exactly what's going on. It's a creeping way. It's not necessarily going to happen from one day to the other. And very similar to communism, actually, the reason the capitalist system under the Federal Reserve type managed economy is surviving right now, is going to fail because there's going to be an alternative which will be much more powerful. And the same way, actually, that communism failed because capitalism was so much more successful, we believe that the same will happen now to our monetary system. So the failure of the Fed will be accentuated by the blockchain technology because that will be the first, I think this is the first real alternative we have towards fiat currencies and central banks. So again, the failure of central banks, and let's talk about the Fed in specific, but the Fed is not the only one. Again, Europe and Japan are in the same boat. The Fed has failed for two reasons. Number one, it has been hijacked by the government. There's so much debt now on the US balance sheet that you cannot have higher interest rates. In fact, the interest rate policy now is managed by the US government and not by the Fed anymore. And because the US government is so big, they have the ability to do that. If it was a banana republic, the US would have a currency which has hyperinflation and all that, like Lebanon or something like that. So the second reason the Fed has also failed is because it's been sucked into this quicksand of trying to manage the economy. Managing the economy is impossible because bureaucrats cannot correct errors fast enough. Errors happen much faster in the economy than the bureaucrats can correct them. Managing anything in life is simply a process of error correction. This is very Popperian, but I'm very happy with that point of view. So if you're an artist working on a painting, if you're running Tesla, or if you're running a country, the best way to run any of these things is to be adaptive and fast and error correct as fast as you can. The problem bureaucrats cannot error correct as fast as they need to is because bureaucracy is slow, it just takes time, and the errors happen much faster. That's why centrally planned economies just always fail. And we are now on the brink of becoming a centrally planned economy. We already see that there's a third level which has happened in recent days, which is that politicians are also trying now to hijack the Federal Reserve even for things like, let's say, we had representatives in Congress in Washington talking about, let's say, the Fed should do something about climate change, the Fed should do something about, let's say, I don't know, single mothers and all that stuff. I mean, of course, that is absolutely not what the Fed should be doing. That is completely, it's perverse in a way that you cannot have an institution which is supposed to manage your currency to take care of something like climate change. So we can see that the failure of the Fed represents itself also in the statements that we hear from politicians, people like Elizabeth Warren. But yeah, you can say, well, they don't have that much power. They're just politicians. They're demagogues. Yes, they are. But nevertheless, there is a big dissatisfaction with these institutions. And if Jerome Powell gets reelected or not is completely irrelevant, because this is like asking who should be the next General Secretary of the Soviet Union. It doesn't matter. The system is failing anyway, and it's only a matter of time. So now we come to the second point, which is, okay, what's the alternative? And the alternative is blockchain technology. Because the human-centric decision-making on the democratic leadership, on the presidencies, ministries, and all that, and then the Fed and the economic system that we have, all of that is failing. We need a new system of this decision-making of what is and what isn't. And for that, we are looking at blockchain technology. We believe that the Bitcoin network is an incredibly powerful network because it's decentralized and it has kept its independence of any kind of central meddling as almost religion. And we believe that this is incredibly important when it comes to the new system. Now, let's just throw away immediately one of the big skeptical points here, which is, well, governments will always have guns and they will always be able to incarcerate people. That is true, and that will stay. There is also a physical border, for example, that digital networks can't really penetrate. So no matter what, if you need a visa to go to Italy and they don't let you in, or if they don't let you out of your country, wherever you live, you are still bound by the old system of government and boots and guns. However, at least one of the big elements of freedom, which is freedom of money, is given by the Bitcoin system or any other system. I use Bitcoin as an example. I'm not saying Bitcoin will win, but let's just use that as an example for simplicity. So my point here is that if you free money, or let me explain this. Let's take a dictator like Putin who goes after you. And if he cannot take your money away and your wealth, then at least there's 50% of your existence, which is your physical wealth, your resources, are safe. The other 50%, which is your actual body, that you cannot digitize yet. So he can incarcerate you, he can kill you, but at least the money side is taken care of. So we're on the verge of something more substantial. Of course, we have the multiverse and all these things where maybe we can have a digital existence also that cannot be taken away from us. And then we're left with the physical distance, which may be or maybe not as important as we might think. Well, this is really science fiction now. What I'm alluding to is that we could get to a point maybe where we have a physical existence. You could be incarcerated in a gulag somewhere in Russia, but have an existence in the multiverse which still proliferates, and maybe that's going to be fine. And if we have all these things, then maybe there also the incentive of these people like Putin to incarcerate you will go down. So my point here is that because we have this alternative now, there's at least a hope and a chance that also the guns become less powerful because they can't coerce you. The necessity of trying to find solution against coercion has never been small. It has always been there. Just because for a couple of centuries, maybe the coercion that we were living through hasn't been as large as it used to be maybe during, I don't know, times of King Arthur or something, or Julius Caesar. Coercion has always been around. The Austrian School of Economics starts with the premise that the purpose of government is to incarcerate people. That's what government does. Sooner or later, every government ends up in this position. Because no matter what, no matter how well you organize the government, their self-interest and the self-preservation of the people in charge and the power struggles and all these things will always lead towards coercion, coercion, coercion. We see that right now with the COVID situation, which has been hijacked for people to push their own agenda, to push their own political agendas, which often have nothing to do anymore with things like public safety or public health or any of that stuff. We have the same issues with other issues like climate change, which has been hijacked by people to push their own agenda. So any kind of central power, any kind of government, any kind of human-centric government that we have, no matter how democratic we think they are, is not going to be able to survive in this current form, because I think we have reached the point where these ideas that were proliferated in the 18th century now are mature, and they've been hijacked, and they've been coerced into something that is not helpful anymore for the cause. The error correction doesn't work anymore. In fact, errors are being made at a much faster pace than the correction, and therefore we have a system which is failing. I've spoken about this also, let's say, in the context of the US, where one of the big problems of the post-COVID era is that we have a deterioration of government institutions. This is the same kind of argument. And we see that blockchain is an alternative. And the reason blockchain is an alternative is because it is an alternative. Simply, it is what it is. But it's also, it's not coercible. That's the key. If you want a system that takes coercion out of the human condition, then that system cannot be coercible. And this is, at least, like I said, to some extent, what the blockchain technology allows us to do. We're still not there yet. Like I said, physical body you can still be incarcerated, blockchain here or there. But at least you have now a way to put your money away. You have a way to save your assets, to save also what isn't, which is very important. So write history, for example. So there's a lot of follow-up effects here, okay? The winners write the history, yeah, but with the blockchain technology, it's not humans writing history, it's the blockchain going to write the history. It's the network. Still humans involved, but it's the network which decides, and that's very different than the winners writing the history. Let's say, look at just simple things like what is the significance of Albert Einstein in physics? Okay, that's a very political. There's very political answers to that question. You'd be surprised how political that question is. And this is a question that most people would think this is not a very political question. How about we talk about things like what was the significance of the Great Depression on the developments in the 1930s and 40s in Europe and things like that. Very different opinions and all that. So my point here is that the power to say what isn't is going away from humans towards algorithms. And we are on the verge of this, the same way that the power to say what isn't went from celestial towards human-centric during the Renaissance. This offers new opportunities, this offers also new challenges, but the key is that we believe that the blockchain technologies will be much faster in error correcting and therefore much better in managing our lives and managing our economic and political lives, which is really what matters most also from the perspective of Orange Capital Partners and the hedge fund industry. And lastly, I just want to say that also from an education perspective, like I said in one of the previous episodes, when you really think about it, what you need to do as a human in terms of educating yourself, or a company in terms of positioning yourself for the long term, it is actually to position yourself within the context of blockchain technology. And the last thing you want to do is not have to compete with them. And maybe you can also ride on that wave, in a sense that you can provide products and services, solve problems, generate concepts, instantiate engineering practices in a way that they're complementary with a blockchain-centric world. Thank you.